Hello, hello. Wow, sound works terrifically. For those zooming in today, we are glad you found your way to San Jose. And thank you for being here live and in person. It's so exciting to see this crowd tonight. Thank you. We welcome you to a very special evening celebrating the arts and culture here in San Jose, and the beneficial work of Culture Track, which, as most of you know, is a cultural innovation platform. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Batten. I'm the Oshman Executive Director here at San Jose Museum of Art. And on behalf of our board and our talented staff, San Jose Jazz and Mosaic America, we welcome you in the live audience tonight and those of you joining by Zoom and YouTube. The San Jose of Art is on the unceded ancestral land of descendants of the Ohlone Nation, represented by numerous tribes, indigenous organizations, and individuals with whom we strive to build relations. SJMA celebrates the continued presence of our region's indigenous communities, expresses gratitude for their stewardship, and pledges an ongoing commitment to learning and sharing. Our speaker tonight is no stranger to the community of arts and culture, producers across the nation and here in San Jose, Arthur Cohen. Arthur is the CEO and co-founder of LaPlaca Cohen, a New York-based firm that has served as thought partners to leading cultural organizations across the country, navigating changes and shifts with strategic plans and compelling campaigns as audiences evolve and age and diversify. San Jose Museum of Art worked very closely with LaPlaca Cohen on both our 2017 strategic plan that brought us to this year and our current plan that looks out to 2027. In fact, it is with LaPlaca Cohen that we envision to become a borderless museum, essential to creative life throughout the communities of San Jose and Silicon Valley. Tonight's presentation is made possible through support from the Knight Foundation, so we are very grateful. And we also want to thank our production partners, CreaTV and Productionology, who are helping us fulfill our borderless goals to present this hybrid program. Thank you. We're also grateful to you who are tuning in, and for all of you who are here. We will host a Q&A after Arthur delivers his presentation. So if you're online, please send your questions into the chat. And for those of us live, we'll have just a raise of hands and mics coming around the room. The museum also, for those of you who are here, is open until 9 p.m. And we have docent-led tours starting at 7:15 if you'd like to look around in the galleries. And please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Arthur Cohen.
Hi, everybody. Hey, Sarah. Greetings to everybody, all my friends in San Jose. Thank you for being with me tonight and with all of us. And I know there's a lot of people on the East Coast and throughout the country who are joining us as well. Thank you for staying up. I'll try to rival something that Netflix could offer, but I'm sure I will fail. I'm delighted to join you today and to share with you some work that we've been doing kind of throughout the pandemic and continue to track that has been intended to be shared with everyone to provide a kind of knowledge resource and information reference point as organizations such as the SJMA think about their future and what that might look like given the changes that have occurred not only in the recent past, but things that we think will have a really long tail that will continue into the future for perhaps a very long time and may actually create structural shifts in the relationships between cultural organizations and the audiences and communities that they serve. I want to first share my screen to make sure that's working. And let's do that now. So I hope everyone can see that. I want to share a little bit about the background of Culture Track before we start, which is to say that this is an ongoing kind of research initiative that is meant to be an open source knowledge platform, meaning that we do it for the world. We do it so that everyone can access it free online, use it however they may. And we do it to fill in the knowledge gaps. We realize and recognize that there are not many organizations in the cultural world that can afford to take on large-scale research about audiences. And that if we can fill that gap and provide a reference point that they find credible, compelling, and activatable, that's something that they can actually use in conceiving of their future, perhaps developing plans, new audience outreach initiatives, new ways of connecting with community and creating meaning, then that's what we're here to do. The study was first conducted actually after 9/11, 20 years ago, which is astounding to all of us. We've done about 10 of them over the past 2 decades, but nothing prepared us for what happened in 2020. Because this situation was so shifting in terms of our understanding of what the operating realities were, as well as the kind of hearts and minds of the audiences and communities we serve, we undertook the most ambitious series of studies that we have ever done. And thankfully, we had some extraordinary partners and enlightened funders, including a number of extraordinary foundations I'll mention at the end of this presentation, who enabled us to conduct some of the biggest cultural surveys ever fielded in anywhere. So with that, I do want to also give a shout out, as Sarah mentioned, that this particular presentation is being supported by and has made possible by the Knight Foundation. They've been a tremendous supporter in enabling us to share this, particularly with the cities that they serve through their business activities and journalism, and have made this possible. So we just want to give a big shout out to them. Thank you, Knight. And let's take a look at what we'll be talking about today. Effectively, our focus is always from the outside in, which is to say, what are the hearts and minds of the audience at this moment in time? How are communities feeling? How are they doing? And how is what they are doing, feeling, thinking, fearing, hoping for? How does that impact their intention and their proclivities in terms of cultural participation? So we're going to look at a number of different sectors, as we've talked about in this slide. But I first want to go through a little bit of homework. The fun stuff is coming, don't worry. I know there's a lot of words here, but this is simply to say that we were extraordinarily rigorous in making sure that the sample of people that we spoke to, the methodology that we used, the representation of audiences included, was as rigorous as possible and therefore as representative as possible. This last study that was conducted towards the end of 2021 or in the middle of 2021, we reached over 78,000 people. I mean, for a research study for the cultural world, that is extraordinary. We had done a study a year before, soon after kind of the new pandemic reality was taking root, in which over 125,000 people participated, which was unprecedented. And I think the reason for that slight decline from the one study to the next was that by the time we did the second study, people were returning to work and perhaps didn't have as much free time as they did initially. But still, the study was extremely robust. And part of what drove it was asking organizations from around the country to share their lists. And by lists, we mean lists of subscribers or members or ticket buyers or transaction lists from retail or restaurants, anything where they were able to track and hold information that they could share with us that we could then send out this online survey to. The range of organizations represented was also fairly unprecedented in terms of its diversity, not only in art form, as you see in the middle, but also in terms of the scale. Often, a lot of these studies are skewed towards traditional, larger, often coastal, major urban organizations, because they're the ones who can afford to financially contribute to it. We wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So one of the things we're really proud of is that little series of percentages on the lower right that shows a range of operating budgets, which is at least as big on the bottom end as it is on the high end. I also want to point out that working with the brilliant people at the NORC at the University of Chicago, we were able to oversample to make sure that historically underrepresented communities, particularly non-white and BIPOC communities, were included as major statistically significant samples in this study. Also, as I noted before, we wanted to make sure that the study looked like the US at this moment in time. So our guideline here was the most recent census data for population distribution, generational distribution, race and ethnicity, and education level and income. So one of the things that I really like to point out is, traditional studies in the cultural field tend to follow what large organization mailing lists look like, which unfortunately, in a legacy-based way, have been overwhelmingly white, affluent, highly educated, and often very urban as well in terms of being around big coastal cities. But that's not how America looks. And so we worked very, very hard to make sure that we had a wide range on all of these kind of demographic and sociographic parameters, so that the composition of our study was something we could really look to and say, yes, this is a good indication, representation of the diversity of this country at this moment in time. So with all that homework aside, let's get into what we learned. So the first question we asked might surprise people, because we didn't start asking about culture. We didn't ask about, do you like museums? Have you been to a theater? Are you missing going to a concert? Instead, we asked a very kind of basic and I think extremely human question. And this was really driven, I should just give an extra big shout out to our brilliant research partners at Slover Lynette, who helped conceptualize and essentially worked hand in hand to make sure that we were talking to the right people with the right questions and understood what they were telling us. Their expertise is fundamental to this work. So with them, we engaged in a conversation online where effectively we started by saying, hey, how you doing? And we learned a lot of things, some of which were fairly concerning. So we learned, for example, in mid-2021, and again, this is about 18 months ago, 16 months ago now, depending on what parameter we're looking at, that one of the things that really distinguished the pandemic from other moments where some kind of transition or inflection point had occurred after 9/11, say the 2008 economic downturn, was its ubiquity. The fact that effectively everybody either was directly impacted or knew someone who was directly impacted, both from a health and an economic perspective. What we saw too, in this case, we're comparing the outbreak of the pandemic in that pink to about a year later. And what we saw is that over time, unfortunately, perhaps, the pandemic was a great equalizer. Everybody was affected by it. And if we were to do this question today and say, have you, a family member or a close friend, been sick or hospitalized due to COVID-19, the numbers would be extraordinarily high. I doubt there is anyone in this room or anyone who's listening in on our YouTube broadcast who doesn't know someone who was affected by COVID, or perhaps who themselves didn't have it. I mean, the numbers are astronomical at this point, and that makes it really different because there are very few societal moments that everyone shares in and everyone perhaps has been impacted by in some way. However, that impact was particularly skewed when it came to economic impact, specifically asking a very fundamental question: has your income changed specifically because of the pandemic? And what we see is, even though it decreased over time in terms of number of people who said that they had lost income, the degree of recovery was highly uneven and remains so to this day. Meaning that particularly non-white audiences such as Hispanic and Latinx audiences, Native Americans, Black and African Americans, Asian and Pacific Islanders were adversely affected economically to a much greater degree overall than white Caucasian audiences, which means that a number of things happened. And one of the things that we learned not only from our study, but by other economic studies that have occurred, is one of the kind of sad realities economically of the pandemic is that wealthy people whose income was based perhaps less on salary and more on investment portfolios got wealthier, whereas working class people whose income was primarily derived from work and salary struggled. And an interpretation of that is something we call the empathy gap, meaning that the ability for different people, based on how differently they were economically impacted by the pandemic, the ability for them to kind of understand in and kind of walk in the shoes of, live in the lives of each other, particularly people such as board members who make decisions that have direct impact on, for example, frontline and security staff, that gap in understanding, the gap in their lived reality had widened and continues to widen now. And I think when we look at a lot of the social expressions of this in terms of strikes that we've seen, other political and labor movements, other types of social unrest that often now is occurring in or around cultural space, when we go back to the root of it, I think part of what we can attribute it to is this widening in terms of the understanding, or in this case, the lack of understanding, the gap in terms of the reality that different segments of our society are experiencing at this moment in time. The next thing that we found, I think, was also something that both surprised us and concerned us deeply, which is that even before you look at these numbers, what we expected to happen is that the pink bars would be bigger and longer than the blue bars, meaning that around the outbreak of the pandemic, when we asked people about their feelings, negative feelings and feelings of concern and anxiety, we expected those to be very high at the outbreak of this very uncertain new moment, and then to abate over time. But in fact, in almost every one of these negative parameters, just the opposite happened. That is to say, over time, people's feelings of disconnection, sadness, depression, even anger have increased. And recent studies conducted as recently as the past 3 months indicate that these sentiments continue to be prevailing sentiments among Americans, and that this is a time that is characterized by anxiety, characterized by uncertainty. And if we thought it went away once a number of things happened, such as vaccines becoming available, going back to work, not having to wear masks, or not having to have mask policies and other kind of policies enforced, that if we thought that that would somehow release people and make them feel less concerned and less anxious, it turns out that was a false expectation, and that has not happened. So why does that matter? Well, it matters, for example, if you're in an organization like the SJMA and you are welcoming people, you have to understand the kind of psychological and emotional state that they're carrying around with them as they enter into your space. One of our mantra at this point in time is to say that the audience is not neutral. There is so much that is in people's kind of heads, so much that weighs down their shoulders, that is kind of part of the state of affairs, the state of the emotional reality of this country at this moment, that we need to understand and somehow see and navigate our role relative to this emotional reality. What do people want more of in their lives right now? We're the fun guys. We've been almost, I don't know, it's been pointed out in the past that when we've done previous studies and we ask people what they want most out of a cultural experience, the fun comes up first. And I think that's, it concerns people, but I think it concerns them because it might not actually be what they think it is. Meaning that the fun to us isn't a circusification of culture. It's not about that lightning or kind of, some kind of fun release. Rather, it is the idea that so much of what people's daily experiences are these days is not fun, that they look to places such as cultural space, entertainment, arts, all sorts of leisure activities as a way to feel something other than that feeling. And if you want to know what that feeling is, I sometimes call it the NPR effect. For those of you who commute or perhaps listen to Morning Edition, as much as we or some might love it, when you're done, that was a lot. And there's a lot to shake off each day, a lot of incoming, a lot of things that seem to increase people's level of worry or anxiety or concern. So it is not at all surprising that the things that they seek are in a way the antidote to that. Fun, in some cases calm, in some cases adventure, meaning a kind of positive excitement. And the reason things like calm and adventure can coexist is because the same person could have a variety of kind of emotional agendas that they have either at a single experience or different experiences over time. But whatever it is some desired other. Fun, calm, adventure, and then a theme that became a kind of drumbeat in the responses to the questions we asked, which is a sense of connection. We have been feeling extremely isolated and disconnected with one another. And as humans, we have this very basic need to connect, to be with others. And the desire for that, or the absence of it, is an indicator of a profound feeling and need that I think we have to really understand in terms of the experiences we can serve up. The next section that we asked about, because many cultural organizations are grappling with the relationship between their physical on-site / analog identity and what they can or should be in the future as it relates to their digital presence. And one of the realities that I like in terms of the terminology that came from the tech sector about what happened during the pandemic is that all of the behaviors and tendencies around technology that occurred weren't new, but everything got fast forwarded, which is to say all these things that people thought would take place perhaps over the next 5 to 10 years took place really quickly. And if you want to know what that means, it's exactly what we're doing right now, using YouTube and Zoom and other technologies almost as second nature now, which prior to the pandemic had a very different relationship, if any relationship, to most people. So this chart, this kind of unassuming, boring looking little bar chart, actually packs a big wallop when you break it down. So the question that we're asking at this moment in time is simple. If given the opportunity to experience cultural content, whatever that may be, either in person, digitally, or digitally, what is people's preference? And right now, if given that choice, the majority of people, about 2/3, still say they expect to prefer it in person. But these two lighter and darker purple boxes together, which comprise about 1/3 of the people we spoke to, and again, that's a huge number, say they either expect to prefer online content in the future or are agnostic about it, which breaks down, if you can read that little type, into either they will make the decision based on content or they will prefer online and in-person activities about equally. So why is this significant? Well, it's significant because it used to be that this box was just green. And what is also significant to us is that the movement we expect to see over the coming years is that these purple boxes will grow at the expense of the green box, particularly among younger generations. If I were to break down this chart, for example, and just look at Gen Zs, the proportion would be much higher in terms of these two purple boxes, in terms of their preference for digital platforms through which they would like to experience cultural content. So what does this mean? Well, it means a bunch of things to cultural organizations, but among the implications that we really like to underscore is that if the role of digital for cultural spaces before had been to enhance or underscore or augment the on-site, the physical experience, the exhibition, the play, the performance, we anticipated in the future more and more investment will go to creating online digital cultural content that stands alone, that is meant to be full and complete unto itself and not predicated upon any expectation of having experienced this content in person. More and more, these two things will exist on a parallel path. When we ask people the kinds of benefits that they get, what qualities do digital experiences, specifically through the realm of culture, what qualities they offer that are important to them, these three groups came out on top among a very large list. And we summarize them as three different types of access. First, free access. More than 2/3 of respondents believe that it's important that digital activities are free or no cost online. And that, we know, is problematic for organizations such as cultural organizations who want to invest in this and hope to be able to monetize that investment. So I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. The second is the idea that digital is boundaryless. Again, about 6 out of 10, a little bit more, of the people we spoke to believe it's important that digital activities give them access to things no matter where they are and no matter where that content provider, artist, or organization might be. And finally, and for older audiences, sometimes this seems contradictory to their understanding of what digital, activity is. But in fact, for many audiences, digital is a vehicle to derive a social benefit. Almost a half of the respondents believe that it's important to include that online activities include some social component so that they can connect with each other. The idea of the shared experience around some kind of culture, a cultural moment that they can then comment on, respond to, like together, discuss, etc. That these are the real drivers of the qualities that people look for and why they like digital cultural experience. We did this kind of crazy thing in terms of, if you consider the thousands of people that we spoke to, at one point we gave them a virtual blank page and said, share more with us about why you would prefer doing arts or cultural activities online over in-person events. So here are 4 verbatim quotes that we think give a good flavor of why people like digital to experience culture among those who do. I'm just going to read them. So it's a matter of time. Learning from home is better because it doesn't involve travel. Online has greatly improved, and I get a sense of community through my art classes in this case. For the most part, I prefer in-person art and culture events because I enjoy connecting with the community. However, I'm really excited about the possibility of more online or hybrid content that increases access. A really important quote up here on the top right corner, online activities make me feel safe. And more importantly, there is no other discrimination and criticism. For many people, the idea of physically going into a shared social space triggers feelings of exposure, judgment, concern, lack of belonging. And those are safety aspects to them that they feel they are able to avoid. That is to say that they can create a safe space for themselves in engaging with this when it is online cultural content. And then a final quote, I wish everything was available in a hybrid model of in-person for those who can't, and virtual for those who can, and virtual for those who can't go in person. And I think that, again, is probably going to be a guidepost for the future. What are people actually doing when they say cultural content online? That sounds like a lot of words right now. So let's break that down and just take a look at what that actually means. We ask people, what are the specific activities that you're doing most when you tell us that you are experiencing culture online? And this is the list right now, and it is increasing, I think, by the moment. But at this moment in time, about 4 out of 10 said that meant that they are going to an artist live stream. You know, that's a Instagram Live, Facebook Live, TikTok, for example, perhaps on other types of media. About a fourth said podcasts, about a third online classes or workshops, and also just under a third tied for pre-recorded performances and live stream performances. But then look again, compare this box that we're seeing on the bottom right-hand corner about what emotional benefit, what that they're taking from these. And it correlates really nicely with what we just saw. Again, we see our friend fun at the top, but here's also the notion of novelty, learning something new, relaxing, connecting, broadening my perspective. These are all benefits that people tell us they are deriving right now through the kinds of activities that we're looking at on this slide when they are engaging in cultural experiences online. So this next page, I think, is pretty important in terms of its implications, because one of the things that has also happened right now is that digital cultural content has enabled performers and artists to do this thing that in the business world is called disintermediation. That is to say, serve up content directly to their audiences without going through some intermediary, such as a museum or a library or a performing arts center. So even after the second wave of this study, even after the questions were asked coming out of COVID and coming out of the pandemic, you still see that overwhelmingly the primary source for connecting with cultural content online has been or continues to be an individual performer or an artist, followed by the organizations that could present it. So I think what this means in the future is that for organizations to have more agency and be perceived as having greater value, so that they are the places, they are the platforms that audiences who are going online for cultural content are seeking, it means we have to up our game and make sure we can offer something perhaps even beyond what the artist performer might not be able to do themselves. So that's an interesting thing to think about when we ask the question about, well, what would you actually pay for? That is to say, if we asked a bunch of people who said to us that they paid for an online activity from an arts or cultural organization the past year. And then we asked them what made that activity appealing enough for you to participate. So among those who did, the primary driver for being willing to pay was interest or excitement about the content or artist, that the thing itself just had so much pull to them, so much attraction based on its art, based on the particular artist or performer or the content itself, or seeing that the price was reasonable, and then perhaps a more altruistic notion that they wanted to support the artist or performer or the cultural organization. Now, that said, this big blue box on the bottom left, still a quarter of the people who didn't pay for cultural content said that they couldn't because they couldn't afford it. So this notion of going back to those earlier slides about the economic impact and disparity of the impact of the pandemic really expresses itself in so many different points in terms of our research of people who just said, you know what, that's got to be cheaper or free or I can't play. So the next section that we asked is to have audiences map for us what they think the road to recovery could look like. That is to say, what is the way that cultural organizations like SJMA can be more meaningful, more valuable to me, more a part of my life in the future? So one of the things that we asked, just to kind of reassure a lot of cultural organizations who were a little bit freaked out around the time that we did our first study, just after the outbreak of the pandemic, when less than 50% of almost all audiences said that arts and culture was important to them, which made total sense to us because, hey, they were just worried about making it through. They had other more pressing concerns. But when we came back to them a little bit after a year later and said, how about now? What we saw is across the board that all of these audiences, at least in terms of their interest, their agreement with the notion that arts and culture are important to them personally, they all exceeded the halfway mark, the 50% mark. So that meant that the audience is there, potentially. 9 out of 10, 89%, however, identified at least one way that they hope arts organizations can change to be more relevant to more people. So let's dive deeper into that. So first, let's look at what the rate of recovery has been. So these numbers are continuing to increase. And again, if I did this study today, I would see these boxes inching up to the halfway, the 50% mark, and in some cases a little bit more when we ask the recovery rate or the interest in returning based on art form. Now, that said, I saw a study just this week that said that less than 50% of those who had gone to theater prior to 2019 are expressing an interest to return right now. And again, that's an overall number. It's very different. Broadway is about at 86% recovery in terms of the total box office, but it is a very uneven recovery, and segments of the population are not yet coming back. And overall, most museums, at least the ones that I know, very few of them have yet reestablished participation at the pre-pandemic level, the 2019 level. But they're inching closer. So some very interesting aspects, however, when we dive down deep based on who we ask the question to about what is important to you going forward in terms of what a cultural organization can offer. So we asked two aspects of the same question here, one physical and one's virtual, which is how many people agree with this sentiment? It is important to me to have a local venue, such as the SJMA, focus on arts and culture reflective of my cultural identity. Or it is important for me that online arts or culture activities reflect my cultural heritage. So what I want to point out here is this huge delta between the white Caucasian respondents at the bottom of this chart and essentially everybody else, which is in most cases twice as much as the responses for the white Caucasian groups, if not more. And I think it's pretty easy to understand why, because most collections, perhaps most artistic programs, from a legacy-based perspective, has served up content, culture, art, and experience that white and Caucasian audiences view as relating to their own life, their own cultural identity and their own heritage. So they don't feel a need for it because that's kind of what they've done. But all of these other groups, with the highest being the Black and African American audiences that we spoke to, followed quickly by Native Americans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders, and then Hispanic and Latinx, are all saying, if you want me to be a part of your world, you have to meet me in mine. I need to be able to find myself in your space, whether that space is a physical space or a virtual space. The final section is what we're calling visions of transformation. So what is the kind of change that people want to see? And the first question we asked here, we asked for a very fundamental reason, which is that, seems like a fair question to me, a lot of cultural organizations we work with asked us whether they're supposed to be in the social justice game at all. Hey, I'm an art museum. Hey, I'm a theater. Isn't my world the art world? Isn't my world entertainment, culture, the arts? What does the audience think? Well, it turns out that when you ask that very fundamental question to the audience, which is to say, hey, should cultural organizations participate in and be engaged in social issues? The answer is overwhelmingly yes. 3 out of 4 people identified one or more social issues they believe arts and cultural organizations should address. And not surprisingly, the first and foremost among these is systemic racial justice. So, or systemic racial injustices, I should say. So this is an important kind of just baseline going forward for the new world of cultural participation. It is a world in which our audience expects of us to be engaged with the world around them and to have a stake in issues of social justice, to be meaningful to them as the audience. This crazy looking chart actually also, I think, packs a bit of a wallop when we break it down. So let me just explain it to you because I know how nutty it looks. Each of these bars, each color is correlated, as you can see with the key on the top with those dots, to a different self-identified demographic group, as you can see going across the groups that we just saw on the previous chart. As we go up the y-axis, the vertical axis, it is the degree or the percentage within each of those groups who believe that racism is present in that art form. And as we go along the horizontal or x-axis, we look at it by art form. So for example, let's go to the next to the last, art museums. And what we see, again, is this huge delta, how different the world is based on who we're asking to describe it. So for example, here, the white Caucasian audience, just over 20%, I believe the number is 23%, agreed that systemic racism is present in art museums. But if you asked an African-American person that, which is that pink line next to the top, it was about 58%. I mean, that is a huge gap in terms of perception. And why this is significant, there's a number of reasons, but to me, the first and foremost one is that the quality of the answers to huge directional questions we get by perhaps asking around a boardroom table if we should invest in certain things or support certain things or be affiliated with certain things. The quality of that answer is directly correlated to the degree of representation around that table and making sure we are asking an audience that somehow can represent the range of communities that their organization serves. Because if we don't, we're going to get a very skewed response that is not aligned with what the community, what the audience actually is experiencing and feeling. What kind of changes do people want to see most in cultural organizations going forward? Here we grouped it into 4 kind of boxes. One is a kind of catch-all, which is access and new works, which includes the notion access here being affordability. Again, the economic reality that has affected so much of the audience is with us. We always, in any cultural study, if you ask people about pricing, they'll always say make it free or cheaper. But here, the numbers were higher than we expected, even still, I think because of the challenging economic reality for many audience members, as well as, in this case, the interest for novelty, new works or exhibits. But some other really interesting indicators that really rose to the top belonging and welcoming. The idea that the cultural organization that I will support is one that is welcoming to all kinds of people, and also one that engages young adults more. Equity and inclusion, treating their employees fairly and equitably as a barometer or indicator of how fair and just this organization and its policies are, and bringing in new perspectives from outside my community. And then deeper into the notion of community rootedness, supporting local artists and organizations, and being a good neighbor and partner to other nonprofits in my community. So what are the implications of all of this? Well, there's a lot, but let's underscore 4 kind of major areas of work ahead. One is the notion that cultural space in the future, and this is something where I'm doing, deeper work in because I'm so committed to it, because I'm so compelled by what the audiences are saying to us, which is that cultural space in the future has to be spaces that promote well-being. They have to be spaces that enable me to kind of get my emotional bearings and feel better. And knowing that this emotional need occurs is a very different, and for the cultural world, a somewhat non-traditional way of looking at what we are here to do. Second is, in terms of digital, embracing the possibility of hybrid experiences. As we talked about before, a reconceptualization of the relationship between digital and analog, where we see them as existing on parallel tracks, knowing that certain segments of our audience might prefer one or the other, and some will want to always have a choice. The third is this notion of engaging the community in co-creation, listening, having representation around the boardroom table, in our staff conversations, in our programming ethos, so that the things that we do are conceived of in such a way that really matters to the communities that we serve and gives them a voice. And finally, understanding that the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion aspects of what we do is no longer another column, but it's how we need to breathe and live. It infuses and informs every decision, everything that we do in the future, as it should, starting today. In addition to the culture track study, I wanted to highlight very, very quickly before we close a couple findings from some follow-up studies we've done. One is a study that was done fairly recently in May of last year, which was a qualitative study, that means interviews, with a number of self-identified Black and African American people throughout the country to ask them about culture in their world and what is meaningful to them. It's a really interesting study. It exists online at culturetrack.com, but I want to pull out just one slide that I think has huge implications. And that is this slide. When organizations, cultural organizations ask, well, why aren't I seeing these people in here? I don't understand. Why don't they like us? Why are we not succeeding in connecting? And the answer is you got to look at yourself, which is to say that are the efforts that you are making seen as genuine and authentic, or are they seen as being perfunctory and superficial or insincere or just checking a box? Because these audiences, it was such a fascinating study, they were so insightful about the reasons that trust doesn't exist when it doesn't exist between a member of their community and a cultural organization. And the 3 main barriers that they identified for us was the notion of, first of all, absence of representation, what we just talked about that came right from the data in our study. The idea that members of the community are not being included, not being heard, voices are not included in critical moments. Also, this notion of performativity, the idea of organizations posting, something on MLK Day or going through the motions without a sincere and authentic commitment to action and to living these ideals as opposed to just signaling them. Performativity, I think, is a huge point going forward in terms of addressing barriers to trust. And finally, this notion of secrecy. Organizations that are not transparent, that don't communicate or don't share the way decisions are made, the way they're thinking, that create this kind of barrier to understanding that feeds into notions of distrust. The other study that we were able to do recently, thanks to this wonderful philanthropy in the Midwest, the E.A. Michelson Foundation, big shout out to them, who are committed to understanding and uplifting the role of older generations, particularly as it relates to their cultural activity and continued intellectual, social, and emotional development. So they enabled us to go very deep into our data to create a profile about some key indicators correlated with older Americans' attitudes and behaviors towards culture. And I just want to highlight just a few. One is this really important thing. First of all, when's the last time you saw a study where the 85 plus population had its own bar? So shout out to them. So one of the points that I think is really compelling here is as people get older, their desire, their need for social connection, wanting more social connection in their life increases. It makes total sense. You leave the workforce, you have fewer kind of built-in social interactions in the structure of your life, but you still have this very human, very profound need to connect, but fewer opportunities to do so. So the desire to have more of that in their life increases as people age. And this has obviously extraordinary implications for cultural spaces, which are one of the societal platforms through which connection can be fostered and provided. Gathering spaces, not just within a generation, but in multi-generation, multi-ethnic, a multiplicity of voices and identities coming together to form social connection. The second thing that we compared on the far right here is the regular culture track responses, and the bigger box in the middle is the 55 plus audience. And what we see is one notion that is statistically more significant in terms of what matters most to audiences in this cohort, in the 55 plus cohort. And that is a statistically larger indicator around opportunities to laugh and relax, 60%, 6 out of 10 versus just over half of the general or younger population, saying how important that is. And again, that notion of connection rising to third place here, 43% versus 42% in the general population. So really, really interesting just to know how much older generational representatives seek opportunities to have these kind of emotional outlets. And finally, what are the characteristics that are most important to you in deciding what kind of organization you will support? And here we see that even higher levels of 55 plus population versus the general pop see it as being essential that organizations that matter to them are welcoming to all kinds of people. And then of statistically higher, 36 versus 30% gauge in terms of preservation of heritage or culture, accessibility, diversity of perspectives, ties to local communities. So this is really interesting to understand that this is a very vibrant audience. I do a whole other presentation about why aren't older generational cohorts included as priority audiences in your planning process. They are the fastest growing segment of the population. In the next few years, they will become the largest age section, the largest and fastest growing cohort within the American population. And yet, what, are they not cool enough that we don't include them in our strategic plans? This is not to say that we're going to ignore Gen Zs, but rather to say we need to take a really good look to make sure that we are being meaningful and relevant to a range of audiences, and perhaps that we can play this really rare role in society, which is a place that brings these different types of people together to connect with each other. So again, just a shout out to all the amazing organizations that enabled this study to occur, who are listed here. In addition, we had this brilliant panel of advisors to make sure we were doing this the smartest way possible. And I want to thank them with a particular underscoring to my pal and hero, Zanny Voss at SMU, who looked at our work at every step of the way to make sure we were doing it right and that the data would hold up. So with that, I want to thank everybody. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to be happy to take any questions. Oh, look at you. There's real people there. Hi.
Thank you, Arthur. I hope you can see we have a lovely crowd and
Do you see a
everyone's
lovely
paying
crowd?
attention.
Hi, lovely crowd.
And I'm sure that some people have questions, and we have colleagues ready with microphones on both sides of the room. If you have any questions directly, it's always rare to get some of Arthur's time where you can ask directly. Yes, I think we have a question right over here. Make sure you speak right into the microphone, please.
So you may or may not have answer to this question. You had a slide where people are consuming arts directly by the artists, and then you had the demographics of 80 plus, or like as people age, they want more art in their life.
You're right.
What is the intersection of these two? Like, are the older demographics preferring to go to institutions or go directly to the artist? Like, what's that split?
Yeah, we haven't. That's such a good question, by the way, to try to connect those two dots. So I don't have that data in my head in terms of if we were to do that bar with the 2 purple versus the 1 green for, let's say, the 55 plus population. I think that's what you're asking. But I think what we know is, regardless of the type of platform, whether it's a physical or virtual platform, the desire to have this in their lives is a very major part of their motivators. One of the great things about digital, obviously, is it provides access to that content. However, I think that we have to kind of weave into this scenario this profound desire for social connection. So if the opportunity exists and the evolution of, say, technological platforms are such that older generations can participate and feel a sense of social connection online that is meaningful and authentic to them, that's great. But I think at this moment, it also means that the opportunity to invite them in to the degree that they're willing. And we know that older populations are slower to return based on concerns about health related issues, but they are starting to come back. So at this moment, I would say we have work to do in both those spaces, both in the virtual space and the physical space, to be able to address those needs and desires, not only for connecting with culture, but for connecting with each other.
Melanie, do you have anything coming in? Yes, there's someone over here.
Hi.
Hi, Arthur. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi, Carrie Adams-Hafner, Director of Cultural Affairs. I've been a fan for so long. So
Oh, thank you. It's nice to see you. I can see you too.
yeah. Oh, thanks. Hi. I'll speak to the camera. So
Nice.
everything you're saying really resonates very much. And San Jose participated in a national study called Creating Connection.
Yeah.
So this totally underscores that work. But when we found that in that study, like, we had some unique differences here in San Jose and California. So I was wondering if you did any geographical analysis and what might make California or San Jose unique.
So let me answer that question by extending an invitation. One of the things that we love about this study is that it is open source, and because it can be sliced so many ways, including geographically, you can answer your own question by going on the website and querying the data in such a way to look at those profiles. I could give you a kind of spitball answer to what I think some of the California responses are. Clearly, particularly given the prevalence of certain subsegments of the population that we talked about, identified by cultural identity in San Jose, with the both Asian and Latinx communities that comprise so much of your DMA. That there are particular, I would say, all of those notions that we saw underscored in terms of the disparity between those perceptions and perceptions of legacy-based white audiences are even more pronounced, as is the desire for community and connection. But you can find out yourself by going on the site, and I encourage you to do that. It's one of the reasons we designed it that way. Sure.
Another question here.
Very early on in your presentation, one of the first points that you hit had to do with people spending more time online, which
Yep.
pretty uncontroversial and lined up pretty exactly with the beginning of a global pandemic. I was not certain why you were so certain that that trend is going to continue, which it seemed to me what you were saying. But if that's true, I'd certainly like to know about it. I run an arts organization myself. Could you say a bit more about that? Why you're so certain we haven't seen a bubble that is then going to revert?
Yeah, I just think the technological cat's out of the bag. I mean, it's hard to envision a world in which all of the facility, all of the increased level of comfort, expertise, the different and more in-depth usages that people have online is somehow going to be turned off just because they don't have to do it. I think it is now going to be, this hybrid future. I mean, this is my opinion, by the way. So other people, I'd be really interested to hear the counter argument. It'd be an awesome debate about whether there are people who believe that technological usage is somehow going to wane or decrease over time as physical experience gets back to levels of pre-pandemic comfort. It just doesn't seem like that's going to be. It seems like our future is hybrid. And it's because I think people are always going to want the choice. And now that they have greater facility and expertise in terms of what they're able to do technologically, born out of the necessity that was created during the pandemic, but now just a new part of their skill set, it's hard to envision a world where they won't use that as one of the many ways they experience and interact with the world around them. So I guess my hypothesis is of a hybrid future.
Any other questions? We had some questions earlier that we thought about here. I wonder if I could just ask you.
Sure.
You spoke about museums working to become co-creators of experiences. And this is something we think a lot about here at SJMA and some of our cultural partners here. And it's obviously, as you know, a feature we've included in our strategic plan.
Yeah.
Do you have some good examples you've seen at other institutions of museums co-creating experiences with artists and community members?
Well, I think rather than look at one particular one, because so many examples are so contextual that I try to look to the underlying dynamic. And I think the dynamic is this: it is aligned with these notions of transparency and engagement, that the process through which programming is, I think, increasingly going to occur and is occurring among, I think, some of the more innovative museums and practitioners is the thing that is changing, that more voices are being brought in. And that also the notion, like SJMA is a good example of this, I think, the notion that the larger cultural organizations in, for example, metropolitan areas such as San Jose, define their role not only in terms of what they do, but the platform that they can share and provide with other nonprofit and cultural organizations that maybe are of a different scale than them. And I know this is something, Sarah, that you're thinking about, so I might even throw it back to you and say, I think you are an emerging best practice in this, which is to say that, SJMA, like I think a lot of really interesting organizations around the country, are now saying that part of our role is not just presenter and authority, but also good neighbor and kind of generous colleague. And that is as important to how we define ourselves as all the legacy-based notions of being the expert, scholar, authority. I think notions of leadership are actually being completely upended now. And leadership, I think, is defined no longer from top down, but perhaps bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Anyone else in the room with a question? Yes, we have one right here. Someone will you might come around the front. Yep. We have just time for one more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I've been really formally formed the entire question in my head because it's been kind of generating as I've been taking in the data. So thank you very much for presenting, by the way. But one of the big issues that I'm thinking about, and we hear the term a lot, is about accessibility, about outreach. And in terms of people staying online more, not going out as much, marketability becomes a concern, right? And so I don't really have a real solid question, except that have you taken a look at whether or not the marketing efforts of cultural organizations are reaching people as much, or if they are as aware of some of those, cultural events that are happening, or has that declined because people are spending more time online now and the marketing for these things hasn't reached them as much?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's an excellent question. It's not one that has an easy or simple answer, other than to say, are we taking a look? You can bet I'm looking at this a lot. What I would say about it is that, it's all about the business. The jargon about this is about, chasing eyeballs. Where the eyeballs are going to find my message. And one of the things I think we're pretty sure is happening right now is the traditional places where those eyeballs were, now everyone can opt out of, right? You can opt out of commercials on Spotify or just not listen to them. You don't see them when you're on Netflix or HBO or most of the services that people use. So when we look at entire media platforms that historically had been where we would serve up marketing efforts for cultural purposes, they're just not places where that kind of experience is going to be had anymore. So where can they live? I think this is what most of the social media platforms are spending a lot of time thinking about in terms of their revenue models, how they can showcase messages that don't seem intrusive, that people would actually want to engage in, including cultural messages, right? I would also say, though, that apropos of this discussion of the relationship between social media and culture and the promotion of culture, the role of word of mouth, the role of peer-to-peer influence, I think is only going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. So the idea of acknowledging and activating the potential in those who are already affiliated with organizations to become ambassadors for you, and perhaps providing information and other resources to them for peer-to-peer contact. I think that the idea of what had previously been called marketing is going to be completely redefined in the future to something that is much more driven by new and changing trends of social interaction that have within them opportunities to communicate messages around places like cultural space. So, bit of a long-winded answer, also very generalist at this point because this is all kind of unfolding in real time, but it's an excellent question and I'm really glad you raised it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arthur. And I think we'll end there. We're peer to peer, and here we are.
Awesome.
So
Great.
thank you, and loud applause so that the microphone
Thank you.
can hear.
Thank you all. Thank you all in YouTube land too. Great to be with you all. It's a real
We're
pleasure.
so grateful. Thank you.
Sure.
Have
Bye-bye.
a great evening.
You too.
And that concludes our program. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy the galleries. The Cafe El Cafecito is open as well. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.